Calorama, a Recorded Books hybrid imprint, presents Disability and Political Representation by Elizabeth Evans and Stefanie Reher, read by Maria Pendolino. Part 1. Disability and Representation. This section introduces the main concepts which the book explores: disability and political representation. It is intended to familiarize the listeners with the various competing approaches and scholarly debates in relation to the study of disability, as well as the intellectual development of and empirical approaches to political representation. These opening chapters therefore provide the epistemological, methodological, and empirical context for our analysis, situating the arguments we pursue throughout the book. Our opening chapter makes the case that the study of disability and political representation matters. It sets out why disabled people constitute a distinct social group and provides a brief review of what we know empirically about the relationship between disability and political representation. The chapter sets out the research questions which guide our study and introduces the key arguments of the book. Chapter 2 turns to the idea of political representation, tracing the historic and contemporary approaches to the concept. It discusses the ways in which political representation has been interpreted and what implications these interpretations might have for thinking about its relationship to and with disabled people and disability. The chapter introduces the idea of experiential representation, a type of representation which privileges lived experience as a particularly helpful way of thinking about disability and political representation. Chapter 1. Disability and Politics. Disabled people constitute a sizable minority of the world's population. Estimates from the World Health Organization indicate that over 1 billion people are disabled, around 15% of the population. However, despite the size of the community, disabled people remain among the most politically marginalized social groups, with lower levels of education, income, and welfare. Indeed, it is rare to find examples of openly disabled people occupying positions of power. Even when disabled people do occupy positions of power, the media tends to explain this as an individual overcoming their disability. We can think here of former U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt or former UK Education and Home Secretary David Blunkett. In other words, disability is typically presented as a tragedy, a negative condition which the individual must overcome in order to succeed. Of course, there are politicians with invisible impairments, politicians who do not self-identify or publicly declare that they are disabled. The fear of disclosure is unsurprising, given the persistent stigma surrounding disability, as well as the desire to be seen as a normal politician. Moreover, it is not uncommon to see disability or health conditions weaponized during political campaigns to discredit or undermine political candidates. The pervasive negativity surrounding disability means that sometimes individual politicians can simultaneously experience ableism as well as engaging in it themselves. For example, prior to the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump made fun of Sergei Kovaleski, a New York Times reporter with arthrogryposis, only to find himself the subject of mockery in 2020 when he struggled to walk along a ramp and access a glass of water. In other words, the relationship between disability, power, and political representation is complex. Whom we elect to represent us matters. It matters because political representatives, acting both individually and collectively, shape the laws that govern our lives. Politicians occupy important roles and can be critical to helping achieve equality. This is especially important for traditionally marginalized groups such as disabled people. Although a wealth of important and necessary studies have examined the political representation of other socially marginalized groups, such as women, LGBT+ communities, and racialized minorities, there has been relatively little attention paid to the political representation of disabled people. This book takes up some of the challenges of thinking about disability and political representation by exploring how and why representation is important for disabled people, but also how disability can help us think about the contours of political representation. we explore why increasing the number of disabled people matters, not only as a matter of justice and equality, but also to better represent the issues and interests of importance to disabled people. One of the central demands of the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us, is at the heart of the analysis we provide in this book. Drawing upon interviews, surveys, and experiments, principally in the UK, but also drawing upon international comparisons and data sets, we argue that increasing the number of disabled politicians is important. Disabled people need to be part of political processes, not just in relation to what we might think of as disability-related policy, but right across the entire policy spectrum to ensure that disabled people's voices and views are represented. Beyond the substantive focus of this book, we are also committed to ensuring that disability moves away from its current marginalized position within the study of politics. Thus, we see this book as an important addition to the political science literature, and hope that scholars who have yet to think about disability in relation to the study of representation, institutions, parties, or voting will start to incorporate disability into their analyses, not only because of the sheer size of the disabled community, but also because of the persistent stigma, discrimination, and interconnected inequalities that disabled people face on a daily basis. In this initial chapter, we introduce our approaches to the study of disability, explaining how and why it is necessary to examine the political representation of disabled people, and how we have gone about doing this. We draw upon important work undertaken by disability scholars and the small but growing number of political scientists and theorists who have sought to think about disability in relation to big P politics. We begin our chapter with a discussion of disability, explaining how and why disabled people constitute a meaningful or salient social group. We then briefly introduce our core concept, political representation, before setting out our research questions, methods, and methodology. We conclude with an overview of the structure of the book and introduce the key arguments contained herein. Approaching disability. Definitions of disability abound, eliciting much academic debate, as does the relationship between disability studies and critical disability studies. How disability is understood matters, as does the language we use to describe it, not least because it can pave the way for eugenicist movements, but also because it shapes the ways in which disabled people view themselves and experience the world. Disability scholars have spent many years analyzing how disability is understood and what it means to be disabled. Let us be clear, this book is not an intervention into these debates. Our brief review of approaches to disability is intended to situate our own approach, as well as to introduce key ideas to audiences who may be unfamiliar with the debates surrounding disability and the study of disability. To restate, it is not our intention to build upon or develop new theories of disability. Instead, we simply provide a brief review of some of the key approaches, noting the competing models for interpreting disability and how we use or operationalize the term disability for this book. We also note that the politics surrounding disability differ across time and space, and that the concept itself is constantly evolving. As Jan Grew observes, disability is not an intuitive concept, nor a naturally occurring category. The range of differing approaches to disability, and indeed to the study of disability, are testament to the difficulties of pinning down a precise and universally accepted definition. Indeed, Michael Prince identifies 12 different ways of understanding disability, including both personal and societal views, as well as functional approaches. As it is well beyond the scope of this book to examine all these varying approaches to disability, we restrict ourselves to introducing the dominant approaches. Historically, and especially in the West, disabled people have been subjected to exclusion, ridicule, abuse, and pity. Scholars differ in their views as to the starting point for discrimination against disabled people. Some identify ancient Greek and Roman societies as the birthplace, while others identify the roots in the Industrial Revolution and the development of capitalism. In his account of the history of disability, Henri Jacques Stieker details how the religious framing of disability as an affliction or punishment meted out according to God's will gradually gave way to the social evolutionary theories of the 19th and 20th centuries, which positioned disability as natural examples of abnormality and degeneracy. It is fair to conclude that disability has traditionally been understood negatively, as a deficiency, one which is to be found within an individual's body or mind when compared to those who are judged normal. For many people, specifically those with limited knowledge or experience of disability activism or disability studies, disability is typically understood through a medical lens, through processes of medicalization and medical discourse. This approach tends to be associated with the World Health Organization's 1980 International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities, and Handicaps, which define disability as any restriction or lack resulting from an impairment of ability to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. The medical model of disability tends to focus on treatment, cure, and prevention, thereby positioning disabled people and disability as a problem to be managed and fixed. Such an approach necessarily renders the disabled person as other, which in turn perpetuates stigma and discrimination towards those who are perceived to sit outside of what is considered normal. Positioning disabled people in opposition to what are considered to be normal bodies or minds is, according to Rosemary Garland Thompson, part of a discursive strategy to portray the term disability, and hence disabled people, in an inherently negative light, conveying oppression, lack, and disadvantage. Under the medical model, disability is understood as a tragedy, one underpinned by an entrenched Western cultural and philosophical antipathy towards impairment. The medical model also frequently has the effect of individualizing disability, making it a private matter, establishing an asymmetric power relationship between an individual disabled person, to be managed, and the medical establishment, to undertake the management. The medical model gives no house room to the role that society plays in producing disability. In 1974, frustrated by the paternalistic approach of the medical profession, a group of British disabled activists set up the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPIAS, who coalesced around a shared belief that disability was a form of social oppression, one perpetuated by medical experts, and one which resulted in societal exclusion. The identification of society as the producer of disability led to the development of the social model of disability. The social model interprets disability as a phenomenon produced by society. In this model, no one is born disabled. It is society which disables people through structures, design, discourse, and attitudes. Within this model, a distinction is made between impairment, the functional limitations of an individual's body or mind, whether physical, mental, cognitive, developmental, or sensory, and disability, the limitation of opportunities to participate on an equal basis due to physical and social barriers. In other words, disability is understood as a system in which people with impairments experience discrimination and stigma. As Mike Oliver explained, the social model of disability shifts attention away from the functional limitations of individuals towards the issues created by disabling environments, barriers, and cultures. The social model has helped resist individualized accounts of disability to create a political consciousness amongst disabled people. As Dan Goodley notes, the model is a heuristic device for mobilizing around disability as a political category. According to Colin Barnes, the social model has had a profound impact not only on the lives of disabled people, but also in terms of changing approaches to disability by national and international governments and organizations. With its origins in historical materialism, the social model has been particularly useful for the political project of emancipation. Despite its continued dominance, especially within the UK, the social model has not been without its critics. The criticisms tend to focus on the model's insistence on the disability or impairment distinction, which, as Marion Corker identifies, can result in impairment being understood simply as an individual and private matter. Indeed, there have been some who once advocated for the social model, but now raise concerns about the ways in which it negates the reality of impairment and their effects, as well as presenting an obstacle to the development of both the disability movement, but also disability studies. Moreover, some have noted the tendency of the social model to present the disabled subject as a white male located in the global north. Meanwhile, others have suggested that the social model is too universal and needs to be adapted by creating a specific model for each country, as well as for different impairment types. Scholars have also taken elements of the social model to develop an understanding of disability which is produced in relation to its intersections with other structural forms of oppression. For example, Nirmala Aravelis argues that disability should be understood as an ideological condition regulated through the conditions of capitalism along similar lines to race, caste, class, and gender. Other scholars have instead sought to explore the universal nature of disability, breaking down the distinction between disabled and non-disabled, arguing that the latter are simply temporarily able-bodied. This model presents a less fixed version of disability, one which presents disability not as something that affects or is experienced by a minority, but rather as something we all experience or likely will experience during our lifetime. Sharon Barnard describes disability as a fluid state, an idea which captures the variety of changes that can occur at the individual and social level, which produce impairment and disability. Such a universal approach to disability could have the benefit of furthering the aims of social justice by breaking down barriers and establishing coalitional organizing, although others have argued that a universal approach could undermine the focus on lived experiences. Despite the influence of universalistic models, particularly in relation to processes of universal design and architecture, it is the social model which has been the dominant paradigm for understanding disability, not just among disability rights activists, but also among policymakers and international organizations such as the UN. Responding to the need to harness a universal understanding of disability, the World Health Organization developed the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health. The ICF model, as it is frequently known, aims to bring together some of the major elements of existing models of disability by developing a biopsychosocial model of disability underpinned by a number of key principles, that it can be applied universally across all contexts, that the focus shifts from health condition to function, with no distinction made between impairment types, whether physical or mental, that language and classifications are worded using neutral language to capture both positive and negative dimensions of functioning and disability, and that environmental factors are recognized given the important role they play in producing disability and shaping people's functioning. The ICF model has proved popular and has been widely adopted by countries around the world. Its novelty lies in the fact that it brings together elements of two competing models, medical and social. However, this ambitious approach has been criticized by some for lacking clarity, while others argue that it needs updating to better reflect the production and differing impact of health conditions. Following Schur et al., we acknowledge that models are often simplified descriptions of complex ideas. However, for the purposes of this study, which examines the barriers and discriminatory attitudes and processes experienced by disabled people in relation to political representation, our approach is one that is grounded in the social model of disability, a social model that understands disability intersectionally, by which we mean that disability does not exist in a vacuum, but rather is underpinned by a complex set of interactions between different impairments and other forms of oppression. The different concepts and models of disability have influenced the language used around disability. The language endorsed by the disability community in the UK is shaped by the social model described earlier. The preference is to refer to a disabled person rather than a person with a disability, to express that the person is being disabled by society, rather than the disability being an inherent characteristic of the person. However, we recognize that the preferred terms vary across cultural contexts. In North America, for example, person-first language, person with a disability, has been argued to be empowering because it centers the individual and highlights that a disability is only one of many characteristics of the person. Interestingly, this terminology has also been traced back to the social model. Yet, while person-first language is adopted by many disability rights advocates, scholars, and in various public and professional contexts, There are also many disabled people, as well as scholars in disability studies and other fields, who prefer identity-first language, in other words, disabled person. They see it as an expression of pride in their identity and community, and an attempt to reclaim the term disability and combat the stigma associated with it, which some claim is perpetuated by person-first language by de-emphasizing disability and separating it from the person. Preferences and customs also change over time. Many terms that used to be seen as acceptable in society are widely recognized today as discriminatory, demeaning, and oppressive. Disability activists have been reclaiming some of these terms, such as CRIP, as a tool for empowerment within their community. It has also been used in political ways, for example, in the context of the #CripTheVote campaign to mobilize disabled voters in the U.S. Yet many disabled people do not accept it being used outside the disability community, and even within the community, it remains controversial. This is emblematic of the heterogeneity in the disability community when it comes to language, but also more generally. Preferences may also depend on people's exposure to and awareness of the discourses among disability activists and scholars. Many disabled people are not embedded in such networks and do not have knowledge of or access to the debates about disability justice and language, although social media has made it easier for many disabled people to get in contact and exchange experiences with each other. Therefore, many choose their own terms which they consider most appropriate, respectful, and empowering. In this book, we, as scholars based in the UK, largely use disability-first language. When we interviewed disabled people for our work, we let the participants guide the language we used. There are two further concepts related to disability which we also need to introduce before we can move on to thinking about why it is important to study disability and political representation: disableism and ableism. These two concepts are critical to understanding the variety of ways in which disabled people experience stigma and marginalization. Moreover, they have relevance for thinking through barriers to representation, both in terms of accessibility, but also with regard to cultural and societal attitudes. Disableism refers to the ways in which disabled people are excluded or marginalized because of their impairments, or, in Dan Goodley's words, disableism relates to the oppressive practices of contemporary society that threaten to exclude, eradicate, and neutralize those individuals, bodies, minds, and community practices that fail to fit the capitalist imperative. Disableism is therefore an important conceptual tool for helping to detail and analyze the various processes and practices of exclusion which disabled people face when attempting to participate in the representative process. Processes and practices which we explore empirically throughout this book. Ableism is perhaps a slightly more abstract notion to grasp, as it tends to relate less to processes and practices of discrimination and exclusion, but rather to the cultural norms which promote the idealization of able-bodiedness or able-mindedness, or in Fiona Kumari Campbell's words, the species-typical individual citizen. Ableist culture and politics frames people with disabilities as a problem, one that needs to be managed at both the individual and state level. Such a framing necessarily renders disabled people as subjects rather than architects of state governance. Meanwhile, processes of marginalization are promoted through ideological, technological, and bureaucratic norms and discourses which render disabled people as simultaneously highly visible and invisible. Campbell identifies the pervasive able-not able divide that infuses ontological conceptions of the normative citizen, a theme which not only pervades much Western political thought, but also excludes disabled people from the design and realization of representative processes. Working in tandem, disableism and ableism are necessary concepts for analyzing political practices and cultures that reinforce the exclusion and marginalization of disabled people from the public sphere and from the representative process, rendering them, in Michael Prince's words, absent citizens. Disabled people as a social group. For those interested in analyzing disability and political representation, the initial task is to establish the case that disabled people do in fact constitute a distinct social group. This is not necessarily axiomatic. As we outlined, many understand disability to be something of a fluid concept. Indeed, there are those, especially crip theorists, who seek to destabilize the category of disability altogether. This approach to disability breaks down the distinction between those who are disabled and those who are non-disabled, reflecting the idea that we are all temporarily able-bodied. This position has the potential to open up disability as a category, but as Amanda Bone argues, crip theory tends to silence and marginalize disabled people as well as fracture the community. To repeat, we are not staging any kind of intervention within this debate. We simply note this in recognition of the wider set of intellectual debates surrounding the idea of a disabled identity. A crip approach to disability does, however, present a challenge for those seeking to argue that the political representation of disabled people matters. Indeed, group advocacy is already difficult for disabled people, given that they constitute a heterogeneous group with experience of a wide range of impairments. To some extent, this is a problem for any social group, as they are all made up of people with a variety of differences according to gender, race, ethnicity, class, age, sexuality, and so on. In making the case for disabled people as a distinct social group, it is also necessary to overcome medical accounts of disability, which present it as a private and individual matter. The tendency to view disability as a private matter is to some extent further exacerbated by the fact that many people have what are referred to as invisible impairments. The UK Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology defines an invisible disability as those which cannot be observed physically, including mental health conditions, sensory impairments, cognitive impairment, autism and Asperger syndrome, autoimmune diseases, and neurological disorders. They also note that, according to Leeds University, around 70% of disabled people in the UK have what are known as invisible impairments. Given the wide range of impairments and lived experiences of disability, there is an obvious question of how meaningful it is to talk about a collective disabled identity, especially when there is not necessarily a neat, binary, categorical approach to disability. For instance, many people become disabled over their lifetimes or experience changes in their impairments or disablement. And yet, despite the porous nature of group membership, shaped by differing experiences, definitions, terminologies, and cultural norms, which means some people are reluctant to disclose their impairments or even to consider themselves to be disabled, it still makes sense to describe disabled people as a specific social group. Indeed, the disability rights movement, which has been so successful in fighting for civil and political rights of disabled people, relied upon the idea of disability constituting a meaningful political identity. Disability identity is a necessary part of detecting, analyzing, and resisting patterns of injustice and oppression, as well as facilitating and working towards social and political equality, even while acknowledging the wide range of experiences and heterogeneity of the group. To develop this further, we draw upon the late political theorist Iris Marion Young's work to think about how and why disabled people constitute a social group. Young described a social group as a collective of persons differentiated from at least one other group by cultural forms, practices, or way of life, and as an expression of social relations. Young was clear that social groups do not rely upon an essentialist view of one characteristic. Rather, they are concerned with the histories and social and cultural dynamics which have created specific meanings for particular groups of people. Indeed, all people have multiple group identification. Analyzing how social groups experience injustice, Young set out 5 phases of oppression: exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence, the presence of any one of which is sufficient for calling a social group oppressed. Drawing on the work of disability studies scholars and activists, it is not difficult to argue that disabled people do indeed constitute an oppressed social group, subject in particular to marginalization, powerlessness, and forms of violence. In recognizing that disabled people constitute an oppressed social group, we readily acknowledge that there are issues with measuring or accurately collecting quantitative data on the number of disabled politicians, a topic we return to next. Furthermore, we do not seek to ignore or deny the fact that within the disability community, different groups exist with particular experiences and specific interests. Moreover, there are also those who would be considered disabled, in law and through social model accounts, who may not consider themselves disabled. Indeed, there are those who, for political reasons, actively reject the label. For example, there are many within the deaf community who do not consider themselves to be disabled, rather considering themselves to be part of a particular community with a shared language and culture. Indeed, the interests of the deaf community may run counter to the demand.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?